So we got the Q&A going. The Q&A is going to be done by Portland-based freelance journalist, filmmaker, and extraordinaire Brian Libby. And if you guys have questions after this done,
thanks a lot, and thanks to all of you for coming, and Stuart, great work, obviously, and I think the first thing I'd like to ask you is just about the kind of journey that you went on making this, and I guess that could be answered in a number of ways because it was probably arduous journey just to get it made, but I'm also thinking about the journey in terms of making these distinct parts, and I think a lot of us may have seen Roses a couple of years ago, and so I wondered how this unfolded for you, like if you always knew that it would have the film that it would have the form that it had, or were you kind of first making Roses as a thing into itself and sort of deciding later how it would go with the other pieces, or what was your process like artistically, just kind of envisioning all this?
Well, I started Roses. It's very interesting how all this started. It started in May of 2012. So in a week, it will have been 6 years since I filmed the first images for this. And the original concept was to make a music video for a Portland artist for, I know.
And it kind of is in the sense that Roses is, in a sense.
Yeah, and I suddenly started going out into the city, and I started getting this film back. And I was astounded by the quality of 16mm black and white, that it had this haunting quality, it had the super grain, and I thought, I can make a short out of this. Maybe it'll be 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes. And, that's what Roses became. I finished Roses in early 2014, and I basically went out at dusk in terms of the first 25, 30 minutes of the film. Went out at dusk for about 18 months straight and just filmed things that seemed significant in the city to me. Particularly areas that I saw that having historical documentation of would be important because they would no longer exist.
Like Centennial Mills turned out to be the case, which you came back around to at the end.
Yeah, that last image in Flashes of Light was filmed just over 2 years ago. And it kind of, I think, without giving away too much of my intention, it does chart some of the change of Centennial Mills over the course of the time I filmed it. But yeah, that was Roses. There was someone who was a good friend, Ken Lloyd, who was at the screening for Roses and had very kind things to say about it. And he runs an organization called Underground here in town. He's no longer in charge of it, but he came to me and said, how would you like to make a film with my friends that live outdoors? And I said, I'm not sure. I'll have to meet some of them and we'll go from there. And I built relationships with a lot of the people you saw in the film over the course of a year and a half, really. And it took quite a while before people felt safe sharing things that were very dear to them, sharing their stories, sharing things that were on their heart, because a lot of these folks, every ordinance, every single thing that happens in the city has an immediate effect on them, so they have a lot to talk about. And that was just kind of how that piece developed. It was a very different form of documentation. I had no intention, to answer your question, of putting it together with Roses.
Yeah, it's interesting that you eventually worked your way to that.
Yeah, I thought, this is a different form of documentation. And somewhere in the back of my mind while I was making Roses, I thought, I've always wanted to do a project with flash frames, or what people always refer to as film burns, which is this thing that happens in the camera when you're turning it on from its resting state, which is at 0 frames per second, to 24 frames per second, which is what most cinema is filmed at. That's how we synchronize sound, is with 24 frames per second. When you're turning the camera on, it's letting in more light between 0 and 24 frames, I'm sure you know as a filmmaker too. So you get these crazy exposures where there's lots of light coming into the room. You might be filming someone at night, and suddenly you have this very strange image that's reflective of something that you just wouldn't necessarily see with your eye. And that's kind of the beauty of film. So having that in the back of my mind, I thought, I have all these flash frames from Roses. And at the time I was filming a bunch of things in the city with just various protests, like with the Community Alliance of Tenants and that sort of thing that I saw was going on in the city with regard to things that people were talking about. And I thought, is it possible to weave this together with something that's reflective of the nature of cinema and how we use the camera? And it also uses flash frames, and that project was ended up being very challenging to edit. And I still don't know. I'm still asking the question: do these three pieces work together? And I'm hopeful that they do.
I think they do. For me, it's always a little bit different when you know the filmmaker a little bit, and I've met you a couple of times or gone to a movie with you once, and so maybe the fact that I know you a little bit and talked with you impacts it. But I almost felt like I was watching a filmmaker sort of exploring what they wanted to do as a filmmaker in a way where that sort of became the overriding narrative. Like you watch the first part, which is Roses, and you see someone who is really kind of loving gathering these beautiful images, and there's just kind of a beautiful kind of cinematic poetry that's happening, and I think like the viewer really sort of feels like the thrill you get getting some of these shots that seem like you've happened upon something, but often with incredible timing or with a great sense of light and photography, and then suddenly we're in this documentary, but that's another entirely valid, obviously, avenue of filmmaking, and it's not just documentary filmmaking, but it's with a sort of social consciousness and really exploring an issue that's very topical with homelessness, and yet it still has a kind of photographic beauty. And then you go to the third part, and it's maybe the most experimental part of it, and sometimes you're reaching this just kind of this pure abstraction, and so it almost feels like there are a lot of different types of films that get called experimental film, but it seems like maybe the fact that you made it over a number of years like enabled this kind of sub-narrative about the explorations that you went on as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I mean, over the last years, I had read Bresson's notes on the cinematograph and Bazin's essay on the ontology of the photographic image a number of times, and
so some light reading.
Yes, they're fantastic essays. If anyone here is interested in cinema, which I think quite a few of you are, they're great things to read. But I had written. Actually, this is an interesting anecdote. Is with Roses early on, I had thought there was a strong possibility that there would be voiceover over the whole thing. And as I started making Roses, I thought it's going to ruin too much, and there's going to be a temptation to be explaining too much about the image, telling people what to think, which is the last thing I want to do as a filmmaker. I'd rather invite them in and have them receive something and be able to take whatever it is that they feel, whatever it is they think out of it as a viewer. So voiceover was not the correct approach to Roses. And I had all these reflections I'd written for Flashes of Light about the city, about things I was seeing, and eventually I thought, it would be interesting to find a way to reflect on cinema and on photography, and particularly as Bresson talks about the usage of sound in cinema and how that can evoke feelings in us in ways that the image on screen cannot. And the same thing, I think I have a shot in Roses, well, there's the space in Roses where there's no image. There's just recorded sound in Pioneer Courthouse Square. And in flashes, I thought it would be interesting to do the opposite, to take a shot and see how the audience, how the viewer reacts to just seeing an image without sound. We're always expecting it. So, yeah, I mean, with flashes, yeah, I suppose it is a little bit more abstract.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about influences, either filmmakers in general or individual films. I started thinking about films that I may have seen that were portraits of cities or that are just non-narrative kind of distillations of kind of feeling. Like I remember seeing a film called Berlin, Symphony of a City from the 30s that reminded me a little bit of this, and I'm a big fan of the movie Koyaanisqatsi by Godfrey Reggio, and there is a maybe kind of small genre of these films that are kind of film essays or paintings that are somewhat non-narrative in the sense of not having an identifiable story. I think there is narrative here in a sense. Every film has some kind of narrative, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where some of your inspirations have come from.
With Roses, I really don't know. I was just kind of going out and photographing the city. As I started seeing the footage, I kept trying to deny, oh, this is influencing it or that's influencing it. And after a while, I realized I think a lot of the way that I chose to photograph Portland was very much influenced by Antonioni's film Linklace. And in Linklace, Antonioni has this a particular part of Rome that's called the EUR district, or the UR district, that he, in a way, it's almost the protagonist of the film, in what you've seen it. Yeah, in a way that the characters, the actual human characters in it are not. And he's charting the way that this area is changing.
Like this industrial area, right?
Yeah, I actually had the opportunity to go there 2.5 years ago and film those areas in black and white. And I made a short a couple of years ago that was looking at those areas. So I realized that was an approach I was taking to Portland, because I was thinking, how can I reflect on the city of Portland and the change? How can I reflect on a time? Because that's what's amazing about Linklace. I recommend that film to everyone who's here. It's called, in English, it's called Eclipse. It's by the Italian filmmaker Antonioni. And it's, there's something that is so unique about film, and that we are able to have these hieroglyphs. We're able to see time in a way 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. We're not able to go and look at these things in person often. And suddenly with film, we have these beautiful things we can look back at because someone's taken the time to document them. And so I'm very thankful for filmmakers for the last 120 years for the things that I've been able to experience, like Berlin Symphony of a City, or Koyaanisqatsi, or Baraka, or Samsara, these other essays. Certainly another influence was Chris Marker. That's Chris Marker's film Sans Soleil and La Jetée. I tried to avoid going to them for reference and editing as much as possible, but they're just such brilliant films that it was impossible not to. Chris Marker he was a French filmmaker. He was an essayist, kind of like the French writer Montaigne, but he was able to do it using cinematic language, which is extraordinary. I mean, I don't have words for what he was able to paint in his films using voiceover together with image, and I can only hope to aspire to paint as he did.
And speaking of aspirations, there are more people making films than ever before, and it's almost a kind of ongoing cliche of an aspiring filmmaker who wants to be part of Sundance or to become famous or to, and 99.9% of those are kind of scripted dramas or comedies with characters speaking dialogue and everything, and to make a film like this, a work of art like this, I would assume have to have kind of different ambitions, and so I wonder if you could just talk about like what you're in this for. I don't like if you have a sense of where your career might go from here, and why did it become a good fit for you to kind of make this kind of film instead of to go a different path than so many other filmmakers are going down, just making, aspiring to go to Hollywood and be part of that whole world. And that's not your path, and that's awesome, because there's a million of those and very few of these. But could you talk a little bit about like, what your passion and motivation is and that kind of stuff?
Well, I think it can be a great temptation for a lot of filmmakers there's two sides to it. One, there's the side of coming out of film school and immediately rushing to the next job you get, which can be a great starting place, but I obviously have a lot of questions about the industry and the way that things are done. And then the flip side of that is that you become a purely independent artistic filmmaker, and no one ever has the opportunity to see your work. And obviously, that's not my hope. I still intend this film and any film that I would work on to be for any audience. It's not for a special audience. It's for general audiences. That's what Robert Flaherty said when he was going into Canada to film The Eskimos for Nanook of the North. He said, "My films are for general audiences. They're essays. Cinematic language has to. I think it's still very new in its form, and I think that's the difference in thinking between a lot of people that will come out of American film school and someone like myself, is that I still see cinema as this very, very new art form that we're kind of still discovering. We're still learning how to piece images together with words or with sound, and using it as purely a form of entertainment. There's so many films that are wonderfully entertaining that I admire and love deeply, but I don't see cinema as purely entertainment. I see it as something that's reflective of time. Time is what is distinct to cinema. And if we can reflect on actual physical printed time onto film, and we're able to record that as well, that is an extraordinary thing to me. So I don't know if that's answering the question really.
I think it does. I think this notion of time is interesting, and you talked about at the beginning about some of this, and it struck me that things changed for the city even just through the course of you making this film. And so this is something I also, maybe a few of us got thinking about in the last couple of years as we as a city and community started awaken to just what a big earthquake threat there is. And so I feel like there's a part of me that every time I go downtown or go to certain places I love in the city, think, this could be gone someday. And so, it's interesting, the idea that your film is a piece of art, obviously, but it's also a kind of document. Berlin and Symphony of the City, how much of that, unfortunately, became toast.
Yeah, most of it. This is filmed in the 30s, right?
So, I also would like to leave time to open this up to audience questions, by the way. Did we decide, if I was going to repeat the question, if we're going to pass the mic?
Let's not do a verbatim thing. Anybody who has a question, just let me know and I'll run the mic to you.
Hey Stuart, wonderful film. Real pleasure to be here. Quick question, I noticed a theme of atonal music. I think there was only maybe one scene, maybe when the gentleman was walking down the hill where there was not atonal music. Can you explain a little bit about your choice for such a theme of atonality?
Yeah, absolutely. I ended up using the three pieces of music by the American composer Morton Feldman. And when I had originally made Roses, I was using, for that last section, a piece by Arlo Parrott. And when I originally made Roses, I had also used a bunch of music that was not licensed at the time and ultimately didn't function as well as the stuff that Brett Larson, Brett was as much a part of this project as I was. Brett scored all of the synthesizer work that you heard in the film, and it's actually his wife Abby who did the voiceover. They're very dear friends. But I really started to find, as I was watching the film with something more minimalist, with less melody, that it was opening up space for the viewer to see things more clearly. So the more that I was able to remove melody from it, the more that I felt like watching it, I was being invited into it. The first time I had Brett and a couple others come over, and they were just kind of jamming in my parents' basement. They were playing just some sustained bass notes and a synthesizer pad and a couple other things. And I thought, this is far more effective than the music by Vangelis or by Brian Eno that I had put in here. It's far more effective. And that was a beautiful discovery. That was about 3 years ago. So with People, I did use the piece by Grieg, and the same thing at the beginning of Flashes is another lyrical piece by Grieg. I really wrestled with whether that was the thing to do, but it just, it added a different tone, a different texture, because People is very different than Flashes or Roses. I felt like it was appropriate. I could be wrong.
I don't know if Agency Myers probably thank you for giving voice to the homeless in particular, allowing.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, it was. Thank you for giving the voice to the homeless, and in particular, thank you for allowing the scenes to unlock for them to tell their story. My question is in regards to those long sequences. On several of them, you used, you allowed the audio to continue, but you clipped out a section of the cinema, the visual part.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain what you were doing and why you did that?
Yeah. So, mostly it has to do with rhythm. And in some of the scenarios, obviously with film, there are limitations. I have 11 minutes a roll, and sometimes it was as simple as I ran out of film, but I still had audio, and I thought, wow, this is beautiful what this person has to say. This really needs to be heard. So sometimes that was the reason why. I think the most noticeable point at which it switches to an image while someone's still speaking is at the end when my friend Steven is talking, and then his voice just kind of passes away. And I don't know, I think it's interesting how often with people on the street, we, at least in my experience over years of talking to people, we often, it often feels like anecdotes. Like we remember certain things, we remember images, we remember sounds of talking to them, but oftentimes we'll say, oh, I'll come back here, I'll take the time, I'll come back and check on you, and it just kind of remains a memory. It's something that's lingering, and suddenly, before we know it, we haven't seen the person in the same spot, or we haven't taken the time to go back to them for years, and suddenly it's just an image or a sound that we remember, and I don't know. I guess that's the best answer I can give to that. I hope that's helpful.
Sorry.
Stuart, great job.
Thank you.
I really admire the longevity of your project, how it became a journey, and how it became something even that you weren't sure what it was at the start. A lot of us here are creatives in our own right or not, but are very busy people and live in a very busy, instant reward, instant access world. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about what this style of approach, with this long-term creative project, what that means to you, what you absorb from that, how that kind of maybe calms you, and if there's any advice you can give to other fellow creatives as far as having ideas, but maybe having struggles with the pressures of time.
Thank you, Omar. Making a film, there's so much misery and so much joy, particularly in the editing process. The editing process, as I mentioned to someone else earlier tonight, is really, I'd say somewhere between, at least for me on this project, was somewhere between 95 to 98% of the time. The time that I actually spend filming things and preparing and setting up compared to the amount of time I usually spend in a dark or somewhat dark room by myself editing is, it's a very small portion of it. But they're both, one has to exist in order for the other to. And in editing, editing I see is really, particularly with this form, with essay, is where the film really gets made. You have these images, you have these ideas, and unless you're really willing to take the time to allow them to marinate and allow things to manifest in their own course, a lot of artistic projects don't really come to fruition. Like I'm thinking of, I was reading something last year regarding Andrew Wyeth, the American painter, who the Art Museum had a wonderful exhibition on last year, or earlier this year. But he's talking about how he would paint things usually in his hometown in Pennsylvania or on the coast of Maine, and oftentimes he would paint something. He'd paint a very large piece, he'd have 3-4 sketches of it before he'd even begin, and then oftentimes he would paint it and it would pass away because he wasn't happy with it, and then he would repaint it. And I think making a film is very similar to that. There were sections of the film that there was one section a few years ago that I spent almost 2 months working on every day and had to allow to pass away because it was the necessary thing. I think it's a great danger for young artists to become too attached to their own work. And as a photographer, I mean, a huge part of being a photographer, particularly when you're making an exhibition, is being able to choose, being able to look through things and say, wow, this is great, wow, this is great, but what really evokes, what draws associations and feeling. And I think those are choices that you have to be able, or that you learn over this process of misery and joy, that really brings out something beautiful often. If you just take the time to sit with it and allow it to grow. It's like something growing up out of the ground. You're planting these seeds and it's growing and bearing fruit, and that's all that any artist can really hope for. But that is my encouragement to young artists is don't be afraid to take a long time with things. And that's a big risk because our world does not foster that.
Any others? Maybe one more in the back there, or 2/3 of the way there.
The Wizard of Oz famously starts off with black and white scenes in Kansas and then switches to color in Oz. And one can certainly argue that that was done for artistic reasons, but I believe, if memory serves, that actually it was a technological, it was a decision driven by technology, availability of color. I think you told me in a previous conversation that you started the project in black and white film and chose to continue it in black and white film. And I didn't get a clear impression as to whether or not that was a conscious artistic decision or whether that was one largely convenience. If you had switched to color and or digital photography in the middle of the project, would you have done what you did differently, or would you have done something different? And would you choose that medium for your next music video?
Thank you, John. That's actually a really good question. So with regard to, I became apparent very quickly when I was filming Roses that when you're dealing with lines and architecture and decay, I cannot imagine having filmed those things in color. It's just different. It's very, very different. I can't imagine it. I've seen Matt McCormick shot a piece in the city of Portland. What's the name of it?
Some days are better than others.
No, the short from like 2002, the famous
Like
one.
the subconscious art of graffiti removal.
Yes, can you repeat that?
The subconscious art of graffiti removal.
Yes, and that was shot in color in Portland, and it's the images in it are very, very compelling. I think if I was going to ever shoot something in a city, I think if there was a way to use color in a way that was muted, I think that would be more compelling than something that's very overly saturated. That's just me. That's a personal taste thing. But with regard to the second film, I had initially thought I was going to shoot that in color. I shot a trailer or just kind of some sketches in the summer 2014, and they were shot in color. And as I got working on the project, I shot a couple rolls in black and white. It was an artistic choice. And I thought, that's when I started to have the idea of continuity of putting these pieces together. And I thought, if I'm switching the color in the middle of this, it's going to be very much harder to put these pieces together. So it became necessary for me, for the sake of continuity, to shoot the rest of it in black and white. Could it have worked shooting the middle section in color? Could have been an interesting touch, but that was the choice I ended up making. I've seen Andrei Tarkovsky, for instance, similar to The Wizard of Oz, Russian filmmaker. He, sometimes I don't believe him when he said it, but he said he was forced as well by the Soviet government. He was given all these different film stocks. He was given black and white some days, and sepia some days, and color some days, and that translates into some of the most beautiful films I've ever seen that seem seamless in the way they transition from color to black and white. So I don't really believe him when he says that, but it's similar to The Wizard of Oz. So in terms of the future, I would love to shoot in color, and I would be open to the possibility of switching back and forth that can be done effectively. There's something that can be very dreamlike about these seamless shifts like you see in Tarkovsky's film Solaris, which I recommend.
Great. Well, on that note, maybe it's time to give Stuart a hand and thank you all for coming.